We're from John 13:36 through 14:2. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. And Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? We've shifted from studying First Peter in these devotionals to studying the Gospel of John. But one interesting thing to note is that the primary exchange in this text in John begins with Simon Peter, who's the one who authored the words of First Peter, we believe. So that's certainly an interesting connection, is that under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, the Apostle Peter certainly wrote First Peter. But as far as his instruction, when Jesus Christ remained with him in the flesh, this is some of the instruction that Simon Peter received, that he would later on go on to write and to pen First Peter. Our text, one thing that's helpful to notice is that we should consider the context before jumping right in. We're in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, if you think of this as the beginning of Jesus as a timeline of his incarnation, and this being his work on the cross, the Gospel of John, unlike the others, is not a synoptic gospel. In other words, it doesn't have a synopsis or a whole picture of Jesus' life. The Gospel of John really focuses in this timeline right here. The upper room discourse, what we just read, this, however, would actually take place right towards the end of the Gospel of John, which means we are right here in the timeline of right before Jesus' crucifixion when he offers these words. Brian and Lincoln, what observations do you have? What would we notice about this text as Jesus begins to exhort his disciples? What do you notice? Jump in with some thoughts.
Yeah, I think looking over this, one of the first things that catches my attention, obviously the context is Jesus is telling Peter that he is going to deny him 3 times. And in the very next verse is this thing about letting their hearts not being troubled. That really caught my attention because obviously that's in the bigger context of this whole upper room discourse, Jesus saying, hey, I'm getting ready to be crucified, resurrected, and ascending, leaving you. So it's a broader, that command, let your hearts not be troubled, is for all of them. But Peter is included in that. That really caught my attention.
Right. You're going to deny me 3 times. Let not your hearts. That's the immediate flow of thought there in the Gospel of John. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. What other contextual things maybe we should say about the book of John? It's towards the end of Jesus's life here. We're really right up until the crucifixion here. Observations, contextual things that we should consider?
Yeah, I think not only should we have in mind Peter's denial, which Jesus predicts here, but also there's Jesus's departure, which he foretells earlier in chapter 13. I think that's particularly even the question you see here in verse 36, where are you going, Lord? So Peter's disturbed because Jesus is saying he's going to leave.
Right. So this is on the eve of Jesus's departure. And interestingly enough, the text starts with, where are you going? And down here, he says, I go to prepare a place for you. So that the top and tail of a passage, it seems to be, in the middle of this is this whole idea that Jesus is going to leave. Jesus is going to leave them. Yeah. So interestingly, one of the things, of course, we'd want to notice here is that this is commonly thought of as the upper room discourse. And that Jesus, of course, begins with this commandment here, which he says, let not your hearts be troubled. And this is sort of the beginning of this long exhortation that's going to follow here. Let not your hearts be troubled. What might Jesus be discussing here when he thinks about the troubled heart of the disciples, right? So what is in view here? Why might their hearts be? I don't want to just read in our trouble into this, but why might the disciples' hearts be troubled? What are some reasons in the backdrop of this idea of trouble? What sort of trouble is this talking about, guys?
Certainly what Lincoln just mentioned, that Jesus is telling them, I'm getting ready to leave. I'm heading out. And, they've been with Jesus for 3 years now. this would be really, really difficult for them. They're about to lose their leader, their master, their friend.
There's just some sadness there, Brian, that Jesus is going to exit.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. So that might mean sadness of the disciples. What else might that mean?
I think it's also anxiety or fear, because earlier in chapter 13, Jesus predicts that someone in their group is going to betray them.
Right.
So this sense of foreboding and fear, and who is it? Is it me, Lord? So I think in the midst of that, there's also the sense of what's happening. Like our group is breaking apart.
Yeah. Our group is going to disband. Jesus, you're
Right.
saying you're leaving. There's this overwhelming sense of what on earth is God doing? We thought we were on the winning team when we decided to sign up to follow you, Jesus. Now you're leaving and the band is going to be broken up. What's going on? Yeah. Yeah, that would be definitely very, very troublesome.
I think the other
Also,
thing that's in here
yeah.
is just, shortly before this was when Jesus told them that one of them would betray them or betray him. And then, he highlighted Judas, and then Judas left. So there's this whole thing. If somebody's going to betray us, Judas walks out the room. They're all confused. And then he tells them to love one another.
Right.
So
sadness.
The whole thing is just very, be very, cognitively dissonant.
Dissonant, sadness, confusion. Go ahead, Link.
Yeah, I was just going to say, even in the passage, Jesus predicts Peter's denial here.
Right.
So the leader, if there's a secondary leader of the group, it's Peter, and he's going to fail 3 times. That's what Jesus says.
Right. So here, this is helpful. So in other words, the trouble that's probably in view here is sadness, confusion, a disbanding of the fellowship of the 12 and Jesus, who he spent time with these guys and they were friends with. Betrayal, but also I think what's important, what you're pointing out, Lincoln, is also this feeling of personal inadequacy and failure on the eve of Jesus's departure. So the biggest thing in history is about to go down, and Jesus is saying, yeah, just so you know, and you also aren't as good as you thought you were. You're not as hot as you thought. As a matter of fact, you are going to, not just once, but twice, but 3 times, you're going to sort of deny me. Maybe all that's probably wrapped up in that word trouble.
Yeah. Jesus certainly has a way of motivating people, right? Just the way he's speaking here, he's just very honest about the hardships. And it doesn't feel like, at least at the beginning, very motivational.
Right.
And I appreciate what you're saying, Link, that he exposes their weakness, but then in 14:1, what he does is he moves them. So the second command there then is, hey, well, not in you. Don't believe in yourself, because you're gonna fail. You are troubled, but believe in God, believe also in me.
Yeah, that's right. And Brian, you're kind of going to just logically what Jesus says to do about that. But I think it's just helpful to recognize in 14 verse 1 that according to Jesus, there is such a thing as a troubled heart, right?
Yeah.
That's a thing. And it seems like there's good reason for that. Personal failure, Jesus's plan not being the same thing as your plan, just sort of disappointment of following Christ. Probably they had expectations of this leading to something a little bit more triumphant than Jesus's departure and exit, and then saying, just so you know, you can't follow me right now. You're going to follow me later on. And that's a helpful thing. So a troubled heart is a diagnosis that Jesus talks about on this side of glory, right? Between his first coming and his second coming, there's such a thing as we're going to be troubled, and probably there, in that sense, we can really, really relate. Let's talk a little bit about logically what you're doing, Brian. What the conclusion here is. I think the main imperative here is, Simon Peter, don't let your heart be troubled. That's the command. That's the command. And hanging off of this seems to be this: believe. How is that connected to not letting your heart being troubled? Like, this is what Jesus seems to prescribe here.
Yeah, Brian was getting at it before. I think part of what he's saying here is you're troubled as you look at your circumstances and as you look at yourself. And the way you move your heart out of trouble is by turning your eyes to God and believing in God.
Yeah. So that word believe has to have a lot tied up in it. Go ahead, Brian.
It does, especially in this gospel, yeah.
Yeah. It is a repeated theme throughout the gospel. Because Jesus is pointing them not just to God, but he says, remember me, everything I've told you in there. I'm very much reminded of other passages in the scripture that talk about this sort of pattern. Psalm 42 is one, why are you downcast, O my soul? hope again in the Lord. There's that moving from what Lincoln's saying, your circumstances, moving your eyes off your circumstances to your eyes onto the Lord. Even the familiar Jesus walking on water. Peter gets out of the boat, is on the water with him until he looks at the waves and the wind and everything. That's what he's saying.
Right. Yeah, maybe we could even catalog that or think through that, because this word believe comes up throughout the Gospel of John, right? That's a helpful contextual thing to be aware of. And towards the end of the Gospel of John, we're told that these things are written so that you would believe, and by believing, you'd have life in his name. What are other instances of this word believe in the Gospel of John? Or what reason has Jesus given to believe in him at this point?
Well, the first 11 chapters, roughly, the first 11 chapters of the book of John, Jesus is giving the reasons for belief, and that's in those, what is it, like 7 or 8, miracles that he does, kind of capstoned with the raising of Lazarus. I am the resurrection and the life, we will be with you in the resurrection, if you believe. So he has proved that he's worth believing in throughout the first chunk of the book.
Right. Yeah, through his demonstration of his divinity, all of these I am statements that we're going to see more in chapter 14. He has done miracles. And, in John chapter 2, it says, when they saw this miracle of Jesus turning the water into wine, the disciples put their faith in him. The disciples believed in him. So he's demonstrated that he is someone who is overcoming the world and has all authority and has love for these disciples, John chapter 13 especially. Any other instances where belief or just anything that's happened in the book so far that would connect to that word?
In John 1, it says in verse 12, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. So he seems to connect their belief and being a child of God, which interestingly is here in 14 as well. Believe in God, believe also in me, in my Father's house.
Right, that's right. Okay.
So something about belief brings you into the family of God. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so let's talk about that word belief. I think because the way John has been using it cannot mean just like meditative wishful thinking, right? Because clearly Jesus is saying that there's something about belief in God, believing in Jesus. We tend to flatten that word, maybe the Disney Channel has done this, but what does that mean? So it can't mean just like hope for the best and bring God into it. It must mean more than that, because Jesus says, not in a pat way, hey, your hearts are troubled about a great many things. Think about all the things that they could be troubled about. And he seems to then say the way to navigate that is belief. That can't be wishful thinking, right? What does that word mean?
I think for sure one of the things it can't mean, Dave, is it can't mean a one-time thing. Because over and over again, he's telling them to believe. And even here again, they've already been told once to believe, and now they need to believe again, which is kind of surprising, I think, for us in 21st century years, because we think of belief as a one-time decision. I believed in Jesus, done. But I think at least he's saying this, belief is a continual process in which you are trusting and leaning on God, not on yourself.
You're using it as a continual process. I think you're absolutely right. Believe it or not, even if you want to do original language stuff, the commandment here is don't let your hearts be troubled. And then these other two things are kind of weird. They're commandments, but they're really present, active, indicative. You could actually say Jesus is saying, don't let your hearts be troubled. That's a commandment. You are believing in God. You're believing in me. You're walking with me, and you know who I am. Thus, there is the way to navigate. I think it's exactly what you're saying, in this present, continuing way to practice belief, to be steady on and believing in. Yeah, that's really great.
If I can jump in, I think another connection with that idea is it pops up in chapter 8, verse 31. But he says to the Jews that believed in him, there's some question about whether or not they actually did. He's sort of exposing them. But he makes the statement, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, which, if you're familiar with that phrase, abide in me, that's picked up in John 15. Later on in the upper room discourse where he says, I'm the vine, you are the branch. If a man abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. Like this idea of abiding in Jesus and his word abiding in you is a marker of being a true disciple. I think that it's a marker of true belief, is this remaining with Jesus, this sticking out with him, his word sticking, which I think you go to, believe also in me. In other words, like, keep taking me at my word, keep
Right.
taking me at my character. I am trustworthy. I am faithful. And then in verse 2, he gives the promise that they can hang their hat on.
That's so good, Brian. That's so good. And maybe it's probably the opposite, perhaps, of a little bit of what we see Simon Peter doing here. So he certainly is saying he's following Jesus, but there's a sense of I will, and Jesus says, will you? Will you? And then he goes to say, actually, believe also in me. Believe in me. You're believing in me. So I think it's exactly what you guys are saying. One interesting thing to note about this passage as well is that when this word trouble comes up in the Gospel of John, you're cataloging the word believe through the Gospel of John. It's actually fascinating if you follow that word trouble throughout the Gospel of John, because Jesus most often uses this word to describe himself. So for instance, in John 11, we have where he says he sees, this is Lazarus's death. He says he sees them weeping and Jesus is deeply moved and troubled. He says that of himself. And then in John chapter 12, Jesus says, now my soul is troubled and distressed. And then in John chapter 13, Jesus uses that same word. He says that he was troubled, and he says, one of you will betray me. So interestingly enough, on the lead up to chapter 14 in John 11 and John 12 and John 13, Jesus has said, I feel troubled. I feel troubled. I feel troubled. And the command in chapter 14 is, so you guys don't let your hearts be troubled. He might be saying something interesting there as well, that belief in God is recognizing that we can stay the course because Jesus is assuming and taking on the troubles of humanity. If you imagine that Jesus, the incarnate Son of God, felt distressed in his soul, and he's doing that for his people because he's adopting people into his family through belief in him. I think that's a powerful picture.
Yeah, that's really powerful, Dave. Just that idea that Jesus takes on our troubles, right? The troubled disposition of mankind, and really our greatest trouble, which is sin and unrighteousness. Yeah.
And if we connect that back to what you had said earlier, Lincoln, about all the way back in chapter 1, that to those who receive him, he gives the right to become children, which is what gets us into his house, there in verse 2. So this whole thing of him assuming on our troubles is in a sense the adoption price. It's what's being paid in order to give us this place, this confidence that we get a place in the house.
Yeah, that's right. It's probably easy to look at the disciples here and to feel like, oh, come on, you guys are silly. Don't you know that Jesus is going to go die on the cross? And that's what we all grew up in Sunday school and stuff thinking. But it really is their own expectations don't necessarily match. And I know Jesus has been saying this to them again and again, that he's going to go to the cross and die. And where are you going? But I think it is instructive here a bit. And maybe we could even shift to some principles that we see in this passage that might connect, I think, to us a bit. One principle I'm hearing is that certainly Jesus Christ takes on our trouble, relates to our trouble, is fully able to sympathize with our trouble, but then calls us to believe in him, to stay the course as the way forward in our trouble. That's one of the principles I'm hearing. What are some other things?
Well, it is interesting that it's a command to not let your hearts be troubled. Now, I don't think it's like, the dictator, coming down hard, like, don't let your hearts be troubled, like, not like that. But there is a command here that, we can't look at our anxieties or our worries or our temptations to dive into those things as things that we are victims of, or that, like that I do have to press. There's an active pressing against it and a choosing to believe in God and set our hope in the right thing.
Yeah, maybe it'd be helpful to make this distinction too, because Jesus is not saying don't go through troubling circumstances, because they're going to do that. But he's distinguishing the troubling circumstances from having a troubled heart.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually really helpful because I think we go through troubling circumstances. We go through difficult situations, but in the midst of them, we need to really be careful with our hearts.
Which is why I think then you jump over to 1 Peter, and Peter is over there saying, hey, you've been born again to a living hope. In this you rejoice, even though you have been grieved by various trials. Like he knew what that was like to do this. And he had heard Jesus tell him, move back to the hope that you have, believe in this.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that's, you can check out, certainly we did a video on First Peter, which diagrams that, I think, very well. Peter says that that he recognizes that there will be trouble. So it's certainly not a don't experience trouble or don't feel grief, right? That's what I hear you guys saying. But it can be navigate that grief with belief, with believing in that, the idea of believing into God and trusting yourself to God with your grief is perhaps how we navigate the troubles of this life. Another principle I heard you guys say is that that belief is not looking inward, right? It's not saying, well, I'm going to lay down my life for you, and Jesus is like, really? Will you lay down your life for me? No, you're not going to perform as well as you think you are. And what do we do with that? I think that's the opposite of it. It's not looking inwards to ourselves. It's trusting and turning to God, to what Jesus is doing and the plan that he is accomplishing in our circumstances. This is really good. Any other thoughts?
It's interesting. This has caught my attention that, Jesus is saying, you cannot follow me, right now. And that was how he called them initially, like, come follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. So even the commands that he, the kind of the chief command that he had given his disciples the whole way through was follow me. I'm verbally processing here in just a minute.
Right.
But
I
think
follow, and he says, you will follow.
Yeah. And there's this hope that you
follow?
eventually will go with me. But it's just like what they've been trained to do their entire discipleship, the 3 years with Jesus, was follow him. And all of a sudden he's saying, well, now you don't do that. And Jesus is saying, no, I will. I'm going to do, why can't I follow you? I'll lay down my life. It's just interesting that, what their hope can't be in their fulfillment of what Jesus had always been commanding. Them. Their hope has to be in him, what he's promised.
Right.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Another thing that encourages me is just in the midst of this troubling situation, of the truth he reminds them of in verse 2, in my Father's house, there are many rooms. So I think just the picture there is that we're not just that we're in God's family, but we're in God's home. And that there will be a time when we are actually dwelling in God's house. This is often a picture in the scriptures of the new heavens and the new earth, is that the believers will dwell in God's presence, in God's home, and that Jesus is preparing a place for us now. I think that's just really encouraging to know that there's coming a day when the troubles are going to be over, and we will dwell in sweet fellowship in rooms that have been prepared for us by the Savior.
Yeah, that's right.
I think for these guys, the Jewish audience, when they heard my Father's house, they would have immediately thought the temple. The temple was all about those segmented, like, you can come this far, but if you're a Gentile or a woman, you can't come any further, or if you're not the high priest, you can't go this far. There was all those, you can't come in. And now he's saying, not just are you, I think the Greek there, many rooms, is like many dwelling places, almost like many homes within the Father's house. Like there's this permanence to it. It's that you have this incredible kind of, it would have been shocking for them to hear that.
Yeah, that's right. So if this is Jesus's first coming, and this is sort of the cross, certainly we anticipate there's another coming of Christ again when he returns. And, we, of course, would live on this side here after the cross. But I think there's a lot of encouragement still to know that in the middle of trouble and confusion, like, Jesus is up to something, right? Like, he's going to go and prepare a place for you. We'll probably talk more about that tomorrow. But there really does seem to be something that he's accomplishing in the middle of their trouble, even though they don't understand it. Let's talk application, and then we'll be done here. What ways would this encourage us, challenge us, and maybe for our listeners as well, in our various situations scattered all over the state?
Well, I think one, and I think Peter really picks this up in the book of First Peter, is that in the midst of our circumstances, we have this resource of believing in God's character, Christ's character, but also that we really need to have a heavenly hope, and to call that to mind. To say that I can endure the troubles right now, I can do suffering well because I know it's just a short time. Jesus is preparing a place for me. He's had 2,000 years already to work on it, and he's God, so it's going to be a really cool place. That's a lot to hope for in the future.
The abundance that Jesus will bring is just going to surpass our trouble. Yeah. So good, Brian. Any other thoughts, applications? How does this encourage us?
Yeah, I was struck by something you were saying earlier, Dave, just pointing out the observation that Peter continues to fail and that he's the one who wants to show up. I will lay down my life for you, but that ultimately he blows it. I think that's just a real helpful encouragement to me, because I think it's just been tempting to sort of root how my heart on how well I'm performing, how well I'm getting my job done, or how accomplished I can be in this crazy coronavirus world of social distancing. But I think this is just a helpful reminder to me that if I continue to root my identity on how well I'm performing, it's just going to be trouble. Right? But if I root my identity on God and believing in God and trusting in that future hope that Brian was talking about, that really helps me to, in the midst of trouble, not have a troubled heart.
Yeah, that's right. Another application, I think, is that we can have confidence that there is life beyond this world.
Yeah.
It's just so helpful, because Jesus is talking about his death, right? And what is he saying? Where is he going? The place where Jesus is going is he's going to the cross. We just established that. And what is he saying? I'm going. He doesn't say I'm going to go die on the cross, although he has said that. He's saying I'm going and I'm doing something. I'm accomplishing something. And through the cross, he's going to make preparations for us. It clearly means that there's hope beyond the grave, And it's so easy to live like this life is just all there is. I think there's a lot of anxiety that I take on because I think this life is really, really it. It can't be. Yeah, it can't be according to Jesus, because he's died and he's rose again from the dead. Hence, there's a living hope. We are born again into the Father's house through the living hope of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and from 1 Peter chapter 1.